So I'm going to mention someone that you've probably never heard of, but I'll explain why in a sec. Mircea Eliade's magnum opus is entitled "The Sacred and the Profane, the Nature of Religion, the Significance of Religious Myth, Symbolism, and Ritual Within Life and Culture." You've now heard half the book. Okay, I'm exaggerating a smidge. But in the book, this professor of religion and anthropology writes as follows: "To settle in a territory, to build a dwelling, demands a vital decision for both the whole community and the individual. For what is involved is undertaking the creation of the world that one has chosen to inhabit." Fascinating thought. What we build is the world we want. And therefore we should do it in a very thoughtful and purposeful sort of way. She goes on later, "In the ancient world, if a place was to be lived in, it had to be founded, rooted in place, and that place was differentiated from its surroundings and gave orientation to the community." In the chapters that lead up to this week's Torah portion, we see how this is played out in the lives of our Israelite ancestors, where the Israelite camp was created as a series of concentric squares, 3 tribes on each of the outer parts of the square, within it the 3 clans of the Levites, and on the 4th side the Aaron and his sons, and within the center, at the very heart of the camp, was the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and at the very center of the Mishkan was Kodesh HaKodashim, the most sacred part wherein the ark was kept, the ark representing the footstool, the place where God's presence would descend into the community. That was the orientation. So in that moment, in that structure, they did exactly what Professor Eliade suggests. They made this place into a threshold, a boundary between the realm of the divine and the realm of human beings. And at the same time, it acted as a vehicle of passage, a connection between the 2 realms. It was here that the possibility of sacred encounter, of communication with the divine, was possible. That idea is what motivated our Israelite ancestors, and in case they had any doubts that this was sacred space, hovering over it was a luminous, numinous cloud that refracted with a light that represented the presence of God. For our ancient ancestors, indeed for most of the ancient world, life was seen as impossible without this opening that was a portal to the transcendent, that this portal to God was an essential for the community to have any legitimacy and purpose. So the techniques used in the construction of sacred space were seen as being effective only to the degree that they reproduced the work of God at the moment of creation. It's not accidental that in describing the building of the Mishkan, the same language that is used in the book of Breshit to describe God's acts of creation are echoed and repeated and echoed and repeated. The construction, the inauguration of these new buildings, of these new dwellings, was in fact the way of creating a life place for the community. If it was to survive, if it was to endure, whether it was a personal dwelling place or a sacred space for the community, It had to be animated. It had to be given a soul, if you will. And that soul was an echo of the work of the community in the light of God. And so in this week's parasha, we read, Uviyom hakim et hamishkan, on the day that the tabernacle was set up, a cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of the pact, and in the evening it rested over the tabernacle in the likeness of fire until morning. It was a permanent and visual reminder that God was present, but God's presence only appears after human action has taken place. Only after we have created the space within ourselves and within our community does God enter and bless the community. That idea of sacred space, so prolific, so physical for our Israelite ancestors, is echoed in the synagogue. From the very first moment of the synagogue's inception during the period of the rabbis. But it also begins to find a more metaphoric expression. In the ancient world, we read in many cosmologies that there are cosmic pillars upon which the earth itself rested. Perhaps one of the most famous examples of it is from the Greek mythology, where we see, what's his name? Atlas, thank you. Borrowing someone's senior moment. I don't want any of my own, so I'm just borrowing. So, yes, Atlas holding up, right? But that's already more of a physical representation than these columns, these massive pillars upon which the earth rested. But for our rabbis, that took on a more metaphoric meaning. And so in Pirkei Avot, we read the words of Shimon HaTzadik, who said, Al shlosha dvarim ha'olam omed, the world rests on three things. No longer physical pillars, but he says, Al haTorah ve'al ha'avodah ve'al gemilut chasadim. The world is founded, the world itself rests and stands upon three things: the study of Torah, worship, and a community of loving kindness. Those three models were what went into the rabbinic construct that we call the synagogue. The synagogue was a place of Torah. It was a Beit Midrash. It was a house of study. It was a place where avodah, worship, happened. It was a Beit Tfilah. It was a house of prayer. And it was a Beit Knesset. It was a community house. It was the family room of the community wherein acts of chesed were done one for the other. So our sages took this idea from the physical into the metaphoric and gave us three modalities within which we can bring and invite God into our lives and into our community. In study, we hear God speak to us. In prayer, we reach out to God in conversation, and we gather as a community to embrace each other, to support each other, to sustain each other, to do for each other acts of chesed, acts of loving kindness, so that they should define all aspects of our community and our life. Chaverim, let me invite you to turn in your